when you start talking about cyber threats in the cloud, you have many different services that users can start accessing. There's the sanctioned applications or IT sanctioned that you've allowed users to access, so your corporate box, Office 365, Google, Salesforce, etc. But then if you think about it, there's the personal instances of those applications as well. So the key is, how do you differentiate between the two types of applications? Then you have this whole thing called shadow IT. So the business is not waiting on the IT department, because everyone complains that IT is too slow to sanction applications. So the business goes out and starts using their own application, which ends up putting your data at risk, as well as the potential infection with malware. So, what we've seen is, on average, there's well over 1,000 SaaS applications utilized in services today. And then 33% of those are actually in the cloud. So moving into the lack of visibility, again, IT's losing that visibility. The perimeter has changed. So you have users on a Wi-Fi here in a conference talking directly to Office 365 or a box, and you don't see that traffic. So when you start thinking about traditional security, they're great. You have your firewalls, you have your web proxies, you have your next-gen firewalls, but they don't communicate the way the cloud communicates. The cloud communicates through APIs and JSON calls. So you need an application that lives in the cloud, that understands the cloud, and works to see that traffic between the users. And then the cloud is becoming more and more attractive to these threat actors. If you think of a sync client, very easy to download data and share amongst multiple users as you're collaborating, but it's also very easy to proliferate infections, malware, etc. So we're starting to see this more and more, and then you have your click-through. So if someone sends you a message, an email, and you click on it, you could be presented with malware. So here's a study from the Ponemon, showing that 48% of the companies do not inspect for cloud malware. So that's a pretty high percentage. So if you think about it, a lot of malware is living in those services. So I'll turn it to GJ.
Yeah. So quick poll in the room, and kind of come back to here really quick. So anybody want to raise their hand and tell me what our goal is? How many security professionals are in the room? Right? What's the goal of information security? Anybody? What's that?
Not to get in the way.
Not to get no. Damn straight. Don't be the VP and no. Right? Who else? Protect the data. One more. Anybody? So secure. Yes, sir. What's that? That's right. That's right. I love your answer. One job. Anyway, so I think security, we complicate things because we get fascinated with the shiny widgets, and there is an overabundance of them. I work for a vendor. You got a whole floor of vendors upstairs with lots of compensating controls to supposedly help us do our jobs better. The goal of information security is to identify risk and manage it to an acceptable level. Right? It's been that way forever. It's not a super exciting goal, but it's an incredibly important goal, because we're not going to be able to protect our stuff. We're not going to be able to stay out of the way if we first don't understand what risk looks like in our environment. And there's a lot of commonality there between organizations, but it is going to be unique for everybody. And then we absolutely have to be able to manage that to an acceptable level. Very often, though, we're dealing with a hierarchy, a political layer 8 hierarchy that believes we can eliminate risk. Anybody dealt with someone that has said, oh, why aren't we can eliminate risk, right? 100% security? Yes? No one's dealt with that ever? Yeah. It's awesome. It's impossible. It's never going to happen. So really what we want to set the stage here as understanding is anybody in here moving their platform, infrastructure, or services to the cloud? Anybody? Right? When we do that, we're giving up control. When I have, let's just use our messaging infrastructure as a basic example. When I have that inside of my data center that I love so much, and I can protect and hug it and wrap it and say I can protect you and put you in this bubble, what happens when I put that in Office 365? I'm giving up control. Now, I'm also leveraging a psychology of implicit trust, because I'm extending trust to Microsoft to say I am entering an arrangement with you where you are going to provide a certain level of service and security. There's an expectation I have out of you as my new provider. Right? And this is how the cloud changes things, because businesses are adopting these services because there's an exponential benefit to the business. Right? And even though we might want to believe this as security professionals, I know I desperately want to believe it, the goal of our company, unless we're a security company, isn't security. It's something else, and security is supposed to enable and protect. Right? So the business is moving to the cloud for a host of reasons. Right? But I have to accept that this is an environment that I don't control. It's forcing upon me a perimeter that I can no longer define. The perimeter today, we all know this, right? It's increasingly associated with your identity, not with your location, right? And then ultimately, it's in a model where the burden of security is now shared between you and your provider. When I own everything, the burden is completely on me. But now the burden of security is between me and Microsoft. Does Microsoft care about your users and data? Not really. They care about it insofar as they can sell you an extra service that's supposed to help you secure that users and data. But Office 365, and I'm not knocking Microsoft. Office 365 is a great platform, but this is how the cloud works, right? Just trying to set the stage on why this is so important for our conversation. Microsoft cares that their platform is accessible to you, it's compliant with the standards that apply to them, and it's secure in and of itself. Right? So if they're running on a Windows server, that it's patched, it's not vulnerable, and that they're not opening up a threat vector that would jeopardize Office 365 in and of itself. What you do with your users and data is pretty much up to you. Whether that's Google, whether that's Microsoft, whether that's Salesforce, whether that's Amazon, it's like buying bandwidth from an internet provider. Does your provider care if crap comes over that pipe? Not really, right? If you call them up, I mean, sure they care, but they're not really doing anything to stop it, right? So keep that in mind, because what we're dealing with is this mass proliferation, not only of stuff that we don't even know about, that users are just using to try to be more productive on an individual basis, but also as a business, we're moving to these infrastructures that are forcing this model upon us. So just, if you think about nothing else through this conversation, right, we are coming into a model where the burden of security is shared between you and your provider. But here's the catch. The responsibility is still 100% ours. Right? We might have the legal out if something goes wrong and says, hey, it was my provider's fault, but that's not going to help your damage to your reputation if something goes bad, or a hit to your profitability, or let's face it, for me, I'm thinking about, is this a resume generating event that I'm going to have to deal with, right? So really thinking about lack of visibility, and we're just seeing the tip of the spear with how attractive this is to attackers, and that's kind of going to be the focus of our conversation today, is what makes this so attractive to attackers? Where are attackers seeing success? And what might we see coming, right? So inside of our cloud, we are a cloud service ourselves. We're a cloud access security broker. We process about 50 billion transactions a day. So some of the observations we're going to be talking about are the things that we're observing within our cloud. And if we simplify that conversation around, and I apologize, I know it's somewhat pedestrian at this point to talk in the context of a cyber kill chain, and there's some debate on the veracity of it in all situations, but it really does help for our conversation today. Number one with recon. When we're talking about a cyber kill chain, we typically blow right past reconnaissance. Why is that? Anybody want to, I can stop asking questions too if you want to. Well, what's that? Yeah, it's really, how would you know, right? Especially if you look at traditional network profiling, there are some interesting tools out there. Could look at if someone's scanning my network, but what do you do if it's low and slow? How comprehensive do you need to be? But what's interesting about what we observe and some of the activity that we see is when we start outsourcing these critical processes to these other application providers, right, there is now all of a sudden a rich mining of data that can be leveraged by attackers to better profile our organization. And there's really nothing we can do to stop this. It's just something we have to accept. And the reason why that I want to pause here for just a moment is a part of your security program, regardless of what you're doing, we have to think a little offensively. Any pen testers in the room? Anybody? Right? You've got to think a little offensively for a successful security program, in my opinion. You've got to think like a bad guy. You should be asking the question, how can I break this? Because I guarantee you someone else is asking that question, right? And they're going to figure it out. They might have evil purposes, but they're wicked smart, right? They're going to figure out a way to get what they want. So if we're not asking that questions, we're probably not going to identify the risks that are associated with these moves. And then if we can't identify the risk, we're not going to be able to manage it to an acceptable level. Right? So we're dealing with acceptable applications and applications that we know nothing about. So it all comes back down to how well do I understand what's moving in and out of my environment? How well do I understand how these applications are being used? And can I quantify the benefit to the business so that I can justify shutting it down or controlling the access, right? Because the last thing we need to do as security professionals is tick off a VP that says, I didn't do X, Y, and Z because you stopped me, right? Has anybody dealt with that? I've dealt with that. I have been at the wrong end of that conversation way too many times because I've been the VP of no for the last 25 years in many situations. Right? So what that looks like, it's nothing really complex. We're just going to use Dropbox as an example. This is not 100% foolproof. There's going to be some assumptions behind it, but every service, if I'm offering a public cloud service that integrates into an enterprise application, they're typically going to have some sort of publicly documented method to query if authentication is enabled for an organization, let's say, right? Now, it's not intended to be a reconnaissance tool, but I could use that as a tool to say, is a particular organization perhaps using Dropbox? So I can run curl with this simple string, and I'm just looking for blah, 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 right? Let's say ua.com, right? For this SSO state from Dropbox. That's a query API for them to come back and return a certain value, and it would actually say SSO state defined, I think. Do you have the notes up? What does it say? I forgot what it actually says. Oh, you don't have it, right? So it'll come back and it'll say it's required or none. That's what it'll come back and say. Now, if it comes back as required, if you're familiar with the HTTP tool, this is a little easier, as I can post it as a form. I can do some really cool things with JSON. But anyway, so once we post this, if it comes back as required, I could say, maybe it might not be 100%, but this company's probably using Dropbox. How might that be useful to me as an attacker? Yes, sir? Blue jacket. Yeah. I can now better refine my message to you if an attempted spear phish. Now, we're assuming this would be targeted, right? This customer uses Dropbox, so they're not going to really be suspicious of Dropbox, because if I'm not in a Dropbox environment, chances are the people are going to click on it anyway, or at least somebody will. But if I can make it look more legitimate, it's going to have a statistically higher probability of success, and I can accomplish my mission, right?
And also, if they're not front-ending it with single sign-on,
right,
it's even going to be that much easier.
Exactly. But the point now, again, there's really nothing we can do for people using these types of things from a recon perspective. But again, it's about raising the awareness. Are we asking these questions of ourselves, right? What does that attack surface look like in the wild when we move to these applications? Because a lot of times we blow past these conversations and say, we're moving to Office 365 and Microsoft does everything for us. No. Or Google or anybody else. Insert service here. Okay? So everybody's seen applications like this, right? If you look, I don't know if you can see that, this one is not really elegant. This is kind of just a somewhat contrived message, but has everybody basically seen what, spear phishing examples? Some of them look really, really good. Some of them are like all your base are belong to us. You really know that it's not real. And here I would hope people in my environment understand that fitz@netskope.com and netscopecorp@gmail.com are probably very, very suspicious, right? What's funny though is people will click on this all day long. I think you've got a buddy at Phish Me, and what did he say?
Yeah, so I was at a conference earlier this week, and he uses a program called FishMe, and he said certain locations he can get the same user about 5 or 6 times.
Yeah, right.
So
it's if any of you guys are doing like FishMe or those types of solutions to really see if your user awareness training is kicking in, it is a little concerning how click happy people can be. So anyway, so that enters into kind of a delivery phase now. There's no question attackers are using trusted cloud services because they're exploiting this implicit trust that we extend to them, right? If you're an Amazon customer, it's like, man, I have an Amazon. Does anybody else have an Amazon box at their door every day? Because I feel like I've got an addiction, and it might be a problem. But there's a lot of trust I put into Amazon, right? So it's certainly nothing suspicious to me if I were to see that on the network. But we know that this is an effective mechanism. What we'll typically see in a spear phishing campaign is we'll have if a spear phish makes it into our environment, or a targeted email or phishing or whatever that looks like, someone's going to click out to something that's going to end up on a legitimate site. We do see the domain-generated algorithms kicking in and some random gobbledygook. I think we've got a fairly effective handle on that as far as what's available to us to control that stuff. It's much, much harder when we're going out to the Dropboxes, the Boxes, the OneDrives, the G Drives of the world, as we'll see later on. But we know this is an incredibly effective mechanism for delivery. It's easy for an attacker to implement. They can churn and burn through things over and over again. And they can even do things like compromise services. This was for, I think it was the Surprise ransomware. This was not really widespread, but it was an interesting model from an analyst perspective where does anybody use TeamViewer in here in their organization? Right? It's a good app, right? But what happened is attackers compromised credentials and were able to co-op an instance so that they could automatically infect others that were hitting this website. And then not only could they infect it because TeamViewer's a remote support tool, they could actually execute it. So they went from infection to ransom very, very quickly. Now, TeamViewer shut it down really, really fast. But when you look at the implications of it, again, are we asking these questions of ourselves? How much trust are we extending to these apps? How exposed are our users should this activity pop up in our environment? Right? Again, if we're not asking those questions, we're going to be dealing with the consequences. Now, here's a great example we saw through our cloud that kind of just really addresses the point of how we're dealing with this exploit of implicit trust. Right? Weaponized PDF. What we found out later on to be a weaponized PDF once it was executed, you get this pop-up that it's making a call out to Dropbox.com. Now, there's a lot of things that have happened to get to this point. If I've got a weaponized PDF that is able to escalate its privileges and do something it shouldn't, what does that tell me in and of itself? Yeah, that's true, maybe, but my defense in depth has failed. If that was successful, what it typically means was I had a vulnerability that was not patched and was successfully exploited to be able to get an application that shouldn't be able to do this, to actually do this, to now download something, right? Because if we're seeing this in our cloud, it means my defense in depth missed it, and it made it all the way back out, going back out to a public service like Office or Google, right? So if it's coming through us, which we were seeing this attack, it means the firewall didn't catch it, the web gateway didn't catch it, your endpoint didn't catch it, whatever other controls you have in place didn't catch it, right? Not that those controls don't work, but nothing's 100%. There is no perfect security. Ultimately, this downloaded from a particular Dropbox link right here. Actually, the link looks like this, right? I could pop this into any secure web gateway or next generation firewall and block it. Really, really easy. The problem is what our analysts looked at was we saw evidence of they're using an annotator, which is, there's nothing wrong with this annotator, it just allows you for quick editing of these PDFs, that led us to believe that these attackers have probably already staged a bunch of URLs because they're anticipating getting caught, right? Because as soon as I block this, I can move and now just change the URL. Sure enough, we notified Dropbox. Dropbox took it down. That's done. They disable that instance, but now we just go for URL after URL after URL. Now, what could I do to just eliminate that whole thing? I could block Dropbox.com, but can we do that? What if you're a Dropbox for Business customer? Dropbox for Business does not distinguish between their customers by like customer.dropbox.com. Neither does Google or several others, right? Microsoft does, and a few others that would make that easy. But in this case, it wouldn't be so easy. So we'd have to go, how are we going to actually stop this? We can't just continue to put stuff into our URL, can't keep writing this out over and over and over again. So we'll end up relying on our endpoints and shoring it up and looking at our EDRs and doing all the things we know what we're doing. But this is an incredibly successful vector today. We see it a lot. We see it everywhere. We see it through our cloud. You guys have probably seen it in your environments, right? Here's another example. This is an article Fortinet published, I think 2 weeks ago, but I found it really, really interesting for a couple of reasons. One, I spent some time in silence, so I found it really interesting that, number one, again, listen, does anybody besides me believe that like Adobe is in the business of like creating vulnerability? Between Acrobat and Flash, it's like the worst things that have happened in the technology industry. And if anybody works for Adobe, I really am sorry. They make some great creative software, but Acrobat and Flash are not some of my favorite apps. Anyway, so embedded JavaScript that connects to Google Drive. A legitimate instance, and the way Google defines a customer is this download unique ID, whether it's personal, whether it's business. And we'll talk a little bit more on that in just a minute. This was really cool, though, I thought, because it wrapped everything in HTA, in an HTML application, right? Now, ultimately, I think any decent AV and next-gen AV, once this gets unpacked, it unloaded an instance of Nanocore RAT, this would probably have gotten caught, although they could have put this through a FUD or done some modification to it where it bypassed your AV. And what's interesting about these attacks, by the way, the resulting download in this was Nanocore RAT as well. And what makes those interesting is RATs in general could be innocuous. It could be like, nothing's really going on. It's just someone's trying to do some stupid stuff. Or it could be all the way over to like, Iranian attack groups like APT33 that's known to use Nanocore RAT. So we just don't know. My opinion is when you see a RAT in your network in general, it's typically indicative of someone trying to establish human presence and get a human intelligence that's going to be active in the network by the way those tools work. It's not just like, ransomware is just like spray and pray, pay me something. It's just averages. RATs could be more indicative of actually more targeted stuff. It's not guaranteed though, right? Attribution's a hard game. So, and that's certainly not something we do, but I found this very, very, very interesting. Because again, we're leveraging this. I trust this. It's Google, right? My firewall saw it. If anybody, who in the room blocks Google? Just outright. You can't go to Google. Didn't think so. All right. So moving on, right? So from a spread, now this is where things are getting a little concerning. We're not seeing this yet, but we're seeing some trends, and we're seeing isolated instances of this through our infrastructure, through our cloud. And we're seeing a trend that is a little concerning. So when you look at how successful the delivery phase of a kill chain leveraging cloud services is, And then you look at and you compare that to how most people are using these cloud services. Like Brian mentioned earlier, most people are not using OneDrive or Box or G Suite or whatever through a browser. Most people are using native apps, right? So if we're looking at, let's just use cloud storage as an example. Most people are using like the native application that looks like a mounted local drive, and I can sync data between my endpoint and my instance of OneDrive or G Drive or whatever it is. It's what we do as a company, right? I've got a couple instances of services actually. So what happens is we can get this fan-out effect very, very quickly, because if my system is infected, or if I just get an infected piece of software that wasn't cleaned on my system, it can then fan out exponentially very, very quickly. Now, we see this as an unintended benefit to a bad actor, because we see no evidence that this is actually targeted behavior. It's like they target a fish, spearfish, whatever it looks like. It bypasses your defenses. Someone clicks on something they shouldn't do. They download something they shouldn't. It's able to get through your environment. It is able to execute, and then it syncs out. Let's say it ransoms some file and syncs out. We'll look at an example of that in just a minute. And now all of a sudden you have this mass proliferation of this instance. We're seeing that in isolation. We don't see it a ton just yet, right? But as cloud adoption en masse increases, we're a little concerned about this, because right now we see this as an unintended benefit to attackers. But what happens when they start targeting this vector? When they really start applying that wicked smart genius that they have on how to accomplish their mission, to say, okay, if this is how users are using their data, how can we start messing with that, right? Today we're not seeing evidence that they're actually doing that, but it's almost like, I don't want to talk in terms of fear, uncertainty, and doubt, but it's almost like this is just too good of an opportunity for a bad guy not to take advantage of it at some point. I'm of the opinion that one of the reasons why we're not seeing a rapid acceleration of focusing on this vector is because the stuff they're doing today is easy and it works. As soon as it gets a little harder and it stops being as successful, this is, in my opinion, going to be one of the next vector. But again, we have to be asking, how do we control this? How do we identify that it's happening? How do we identify the data that's even there? Do I even care, right? If it's somebody sharing their kids' pics, I honestly don't care. But if it's my customer database, if it's something really important in my organization, that's really important to me. If I'm infecting files to partners, that's also important, right? Okay, some quick examples for command and control, just to kind of prove the point and put it to bed, right? We saw last year Google Docs actually being used for the distribution of ransomware keys. Again, exploiting the psychology of implicit trust. And I think Zminer was using AWS for its command and control, right? So this trend is going to keep increasing, because attackers know you can't really block these services en masse. You might block some, but you're certainly not going to block all. And depending on what they want to do, and depending on how much reconnaissance they put into their effort, is going to determine how successful they are in leveraging these platforms to get something out of you, right? Okay. So ultimately, the action is that a successful ransomware campaign, or if it's more targeted, is obviously more problematic. But targeted attacks are not. It's not like it's happening to everybody every single day. Everybody wants to. I mean, I spent several years at FireEye, and it's kind of this. Oh, everybody's being targeted. No, everybody's not being targeted. But you have to take that stuff. You do have to take that stuff seriously. So I want to talk a moment about VLock to kind of, because this is, again, what concerns us from a research perspective is, now VLock is not, anybody that has done any basic analysis, I don't think VLock is an exceptionally interesting piece of malware, other than the fact that, and it's been around, there's good coverage for it, it's not like the sky is falling. But what makes VLock interesting is it's polymorphic in and of itself, and when it successfully infected a system, it would encrypt the file, which is a little debatable, but essentially it's wrapping the clean code within itself, inserting its own malware code, and it's now a new polymorphic instance, right? So every infected file is not only ransomed, it is now another potential infection vector for VLock, right? So in that cloud fan-out scenario, if I have a share that I'm syncing and maybe sharing with other people, and I get infected with VLock, I'd see everything become an executable instance. Now, in this case, I'm smart. I have don't hide known file extensions, so I can see that these all turned into exes. Still hit environments that they have this feature disabled, because it is disabled by default in Microsoft. And then it would just look like a PDF, and someone comes in and doesn't know the icon has changed or anything, and they click on it, right? Because everybody's click happy. Everybody who is, that sync folder is now has the same infection. And if anybody's accessing this, let's say if it's a team folder, if someone comes in and clicks on it and their endpoint doesn't catch it, now they're infected as well. This is why I said this is an unintended benefit to attackers right now. We're not seeing a great deal of this, but it is a little concerning, because how much thought are we giving into how we're controlling this and using this, right? Because if it gets to this point, it means that defense in depth failed us up to this point, And now it's just going to proliferate that much more faster. And the extent, get you 1 second, and the extent that our network, our sharing network consists is going to, what that infection vector is going to look like. Yes, sir?
Does it change all the files within C drive to executable?
It's going to depend. So the question was, if I understand correctly, does it change everything on your C drive, the whole system?
Yeah.
Potentially, and with VLock, no. Right? So pretty much every ransomware is going to be unique in the files they're going after. There have been some that have done that. In this instance, no. Right?
So
but
once the user clicks on, well, they don't notice and it's a shared folder and someone clicks on it,
Yep.
then they get infected too, and
Correct.
whatever targeted files turn to executable.
Correct. Yeah. In this case, everybody, if you start writing your own ransomware, you could do it a little differently, right? But the reason why this is because not most ransomware, mind you, does not create a ransom file does not become a new infection vector for that ransomware, right? VLock's kind of unique in that realm. So, because what most ransomware campaigns are driven by is just the law of averages. If I can get 1 million people to be infected, and I can get 1% to pay a ransom in Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is just off the charts expensive now, what does that actually look like to me? So again, the concern for us as researchers, this is pure speculation on the part of research by what we're seeing in our cloud, is there's no evidence that this is a huge problem for us yet, but it's just too rich of a target as other methodologies become more difficult and less successful for attackers. This to us is the next potential significant threat vector within these organizations because we trust it so implicitly, right? And because we don't have a great deal of control over it because we're assuming someone else is going to take care of it for us.
VLock is rather new than this.
No, VLock's been around for a little while.
Okay.
Right, VLock's got great coverage. It is unlikely, so that's a great point. It's really sad that we would see VLock infect people within our net, because it means, dude, number one, you weren't scanning this stuff within our cloud in your policy. That's the first thing we're going to talk about. But the second thing is, too, VLock's really old. Like, what AV are you running, and was it ever updated? Are you running AV, right? So, CrowdStrike, silence, somebody, do something, right? Go talk to the next gen AV guys. Okay, so ransomware detection and remediation, right? Ransomware is a gigantic problem. It's unbelievable. It's funny. Has anybody ever looked on the hacking forums and sites to see some of the conversations between people that have been infected and trying to negotiate a different price with the people that own the ransomware? It's really funny because their customer service is actually really, really good. And there was one, it's crazy because they want the money out of you. And I saw one of these conversations where they're like, why do you do this? This is so evil. He's like, tell me another job I can make $20,000 a week, right? I mean, it's like, are you serious? Are you that callous? But anyway, so there's not in a cloud service we have to look at it a little bit differently, right? The hope is that our defense in depth doesn't fail us. We're investing in the right things on our endpoint, we're doing the right things on the network, and we can contain this, and the problem is manageable. But because if it makes it to this point that we're seeing this out in our cloud infrastructures, whatever has worked is blown past all of that. So how do I recover from it? How quickly can I detect it, and how quickly can I recover from it? So here again, if I've got a system that's been ransomed and that fan-out effect has taken place, how do I detect that has happened, right? So one of the things we've developed is a machine learning-based approach that looks at, it's a trained model that looks at activity that is indicative of encrypted files, right? It's not looking particularly for this is malware, this isn't malware. It's looking for the indicator that's saying that the algorithm is making a judgment. This data movement looks like encrypted file behavior, so I have a high degree of confidence that this is ransomware behavior. Once we've done that, I can then share that telemetry with EDR tools like CB Response, CrowdStrike, whatever, Tanium, or whatever you might be using. Today there's baked in our product, there's baked in support for CB Response. But once you have those indicators, you could put that into anything, so that I can quickly isolate that endpoint and get it off the network and stop this patient zero scenario from continuing to infect other people. But then this is where the cloud works in our favor, because there's an interesting benefit to us, because most of the major cloud providers that enable file sharing have automatic revision control turned on. So unless you've gone in and turned it off, most of them have at least a 90-day revision control. Some of them go up as high as 6 months. Microsoft definitely has it. Google definitely has it. Box definitely has it. Dropbox has it. But what this allows us to do is, if I can hook back into that, one of the biggest problems with ransomware is, even if I have a good backup strategy in place, has anybody had to recover from a ransomware event in their environment? Right? Please don't tell me you paid the ransom.
Oh, no.
No, yeah, right. So, yeah, exactly. It's like, how far back in my backup archive do I have to go? Right? How long has this been in place? Right? Depending on how we're doing backups. Now, you may be really, really in tune to it and you know immediately. You may not. But one of the nice things about here is like we can create a system around this that says, hey, if we're watching all of this file movement anyway, and we know when it was identified, we can say anything up to that point is probably good, so go ahead and restore that file automatically. So it's nice that this exists within these cloud ecosystems, because on a local host, if there is a ransomware event, and let's say you're not backing up, right, it's going to disable, normally we see it disable things like volume shadow services and stuff like that would enable us to recover from local snapshots, right, make it very, very difficult for us to do that. Okay? All right, so that's kind of what we're seeing as data moves through our cloud infrastructure. Now we're just going to talk briefly about what we're doing about it, some of the best practices to consider. Now obviously this is how we look at things, but the concepts apply to anything in general. So, how can we better defend ourselves from this? But again, it's about asking ourselves these questions. Are we asking these questions, or are we just leaving ourselves exposed? So I think you wanted to.
Yep. Thanks, DJ. So when you take a look at the apps, right? So that it's more than just the sync client. There's the mobile apps. There's your unmanaged devices, managed devices. So most of these are direct to cloud. So you're losing that perimeter or your firewalls that are in place, right? So they're directly talking to all these different SaaS applications. So how do you prevent a user from going to sanctioned box or sanctioned OneDrive versus unsanctioned or personal OneDrive? And the key is you need to sit in line and get that visibility so you can steer traffic. So the way that Netskope works is steering traffic. There's several different ways that we can steer traffic. It can be an agentless approach. It can be a very lightweight client. Client's very useful for when users are off the network and understanding where they're going so you're protected at all times. And the key is to apply, I heard earlier, what's the most valuable asset? It's the data, right? So applying data loss prevention, looking at the data, should the data be going into that location in the first place? If it's okay to go into corporate box, should we be taking that same customer records and putting it into my personal? Should I be syncing that to my personal? Probably not. And that's something that Netskope can step in line and prevent that from occurring, coaching the users as to what's going on and a safer solution to use. As we've been talking about malware, we're looking for the presence of malware. We can crawl those repositories at rest and take a look at that and scan those. So if you've been using the service for 2 or 3 years now, what's out there? You probably don't know everything that's out there. So get an inventory and scan it, not only for malware, but DLP as well. And then we're taking that to the next level of understanding who's doing what with what data, where, what device, and what application. So we're really taking that down to another level where you can get very granular and looking at the context. And it's all done through published APIs as well as unpublished APIs. And that's the key, is that we're hooking into those unpublished APIs. So real quick with the modes of deployment, there's log discovery. Very simply just taking firewall logs, web proxy logs, something from Splunk, we can feed in. That's great for shadow IT. It's a certain point in time, but it's only going to give you that visibility as to what applications are in use, which can be extremely valuable, especially when organizations say they're using 50 cloud storage apps or 50 apps, SaaS applications. Now you report that you're using 2,000. We can quickly get a rein around that. The next is data at rest for published APIs. So there's a handful of these applications, your big cloud storage ones, ServiceNow, Amazon Web Services, scanning S3 buckets, et cetera. So we can hook in from the console through OAuth, once you've authorized that admin account, to go out and crawl that repository. Again, looking for malware, DLP. Also can look for the exposure of the link. So if you think about having a public folder and it has customer data sitting in it and it's exposed to the internet, anyone with a link can access it, you might want to be able to kill that, and that's something that we can do automatically. And then lastly, sitting in line. Again, several different methods of steering that traffic. But the key is we're acting as that broker and also looking at it from going to the application, but also in a reverse proxy mode. So most familiar with the concept of a reverse proxy? Okay, so basically if you're front-ending it with an identity service provider, a single sign-on solution, we can reverse that URL, rewrite that URL back to your instance of Netskope, so that you're protected from a home device, a hotel kiosk. So if you go into Office 365, you log in, you can actually prevent download of sensitive data to an unmanaged machine. Any questions? Yes?
So since you're acting as a man in the middle, and most cloud providers use HTTPS,
Mm-hmm.
do you negotiate with the cloud provider to get obtain their certificates?
Yeah, so we're the trusted provider in between the user and that SaaS application. So we're brokering that SSL. So we're inspecting that SSL traffic, reestablished, and going to the final destination.
Your customers don't have to give you a certificate. You have gone to the Box, to the Google, to whoever, and arranged with them.
It depends on the implementation model. If you're using the client that's installed on the endpoints, it's all handled there. If you're doing an agentless approach, there's several different steering mechanisms, whether it's through DNS. We have what's called the secure forwarder, and then the certificates are handled there.
So are you rewriting your URI and URL and pretty much implementing the TLS traffic and everything? Because I've used the F5 as a reverse proxy and rewrote URIs and things like that during implementation of that process. So, does that essentially rewrite web address, URIs, and things like that?
In the reverse proxy mode,
Yeah.
yes, because what we're doing is after the authentication happens with the single sign-on solution, you're configuring it with the SSO.
Right.
So when the users come in, redirect them back to
Right.
this instance in the flow of traffic.
And it's also going to depend on, assuming you've implemented an SSO like Okta or Ping or something like that, it's also going to depend on if it's IDP initiated or provider initiated, right? So if someone just goes to portal.office.com, you want to be able to get them back to your SSO, right? So that's a completely different workflow, right? Under the hood, it's typically all just SAML, right? So in those cases, yes, you're rewriting things, right? If you're just sitting in line, you're doing it transparently. This is what makes gaining visibility really, really hard, regardless of the product that you're using, like the gentleman that was asking about how SSL works. If you've ever tried to do SSL intercept, like on your proxies or your firewalls, it's everybody kind of does it now, but it's not necessarily a trivial thing, and it's certainly not trivial at scale.
A lot of organizations still aren't even doing SSL decrypt either, so you're still losing that visibility as to what's going on. Not to go into this much further, but we also have iOS profiles, VPN profiles, as well as an Android client, so you can extend that to your mobile devices. So when you look at granular control over many different apps, 13,000 apps here, so we have the API introspection, so that's, again, an agentless approach, out of band, no impact to the users, just scanning that repository. But when you start sitting in line, and the two keys that are bolded is the cloud service and then the instance that they're actually using. So this really ties into being instance aware and understanding the difference between a business instance and a personal instance. So a quick example of that is here. We can quickly see that what the browser was used. We can see that it was a Gmail account. The application is Google Drive Personal, and then the instance ID is Gmail. So in our event, we're able to distinguish that that is a personal instance of Google.
So if we go back one,
Yep.
So this is, and like what I was talking about earlier, this is why it's non-trivial. Like, so this drive.google.com, just if you're a Google shop, or if you're not going to block Google, you can't necessarily just go in and just block this at the domain level, which you could do, right? And just eliminate that problem altogether. And regardless of whether you're looking at something like Netskope or some other solution, is a web proxy is typically going to see, it could show you that, hey, we went to this site, my firewall is probably going to see the bytes transferred, it's going to see the ports, it could even break out any individual applications that we can identify in the first 1,000 bytes that we observe in a session. But from a CASB perspective or from a cloud visibilities perspective, regardless of Netskope or anybody else, we got to go deeper than that. We got to go deeper than what AppID provides. AppID is great no matter who's implementing it. Palo Alto has a great solution. Most of the leading firewall vendors are doing a good job there. But what we need to dive into is the transaction stream, so we can pull things out like the user, in this case, it was my personal Gmail account. That's identified in the application stream. This isn't something you're going to identify in the first 1,000 bytes. You have to understand what whether it's a published or unpublished API, you have to understand what that application conversation looks like to be able to extract these objects from it. How does it identify a binary object inside of the application stream? If it's not using HTTP with like an XMIME type that's easily observable in the header, how do we know if it's actually a view event versus a download event in the application itself? right? Because most of these applications, when they're posting something, they're not doing an HTTP post. They might. But what you'll typically see is just an HTTP transaction, and it's funny, my buddies at Riverbed, they have the greatest saying, HTTP is the transport of the internet, right? TCP is ultimately the transport, TCP and UDP, but HTTP has become the application transport. When I was first learning networking, HTTP was an application in and of itself. Those days are long gone, right? It's all about JSON and whatever is flowing over that HTTP session. And the deeper you dive into it is how much of this information you're going to get out. Because if you don't, it might just, to your web gateway, to your firewall, it's probably just going to look like drive.google.com. You're not going to know that this is DJ Kohler at Gmail going to drive.google.com versus DJ Kohler at widgetworks.io going to widgetworks.io's instance of Google Drive. And if I don't know that, how would I identify if somebody is just making a native web call out to just download some other binary like we saw in the Fortinet example in the Fortinet example earlier? Actually, I'm going to jump through this really quick and kind of show that right here. So like if you open up a PowerShell, right, and just do invoke web request URI, and then this was a link I shortened and download this file, right? This is what it would look like if somebody, let's say somebody wrapped malware and it called out to PowerShell, or this is like ActionScript inside of Adobe, right? What that's going to look like is just a native call. It's not going to be identified with a browser or anything like that. It opens up a socket, starts doing what it's going to do. And depending on how deep I can go into that transaction, can I identify where it's going and how I'm going to block it, is going to determine how exposed I am, right? Assuming I just can't block the domain outright and altogether, right? Now, how data moves through our system looks like this, right? Depending on whether it's an active or passive approach. And a lot of this probably looks similar to what you're doing inside of your environments for like normal web traffic, but it's really about gaining that understanding into how deep into the transactions you can go, is that ultimately, how do I process through to determine if something is bad or not, and then how do I apply a policy action to it, right? There's going to be, for us, it goes through a series of static, heuristic, dynamic analysis, reputation, and all the things that you would expect. But ultimately, we want to abstract that to a policy that just says, hey, if I am in my corporate instances of these applications, I'm going to allow it, and I'm going to scan it for bad things. Because I'm still going to have users doing bad things within that environment. But then ultimately, if it's not something that, even if it's Google Drive, and I use Google Drive as a customer, if it's not my instance of Google Drive, I'm going to block it. Right? That's ultimately what we want to do. Right? Netscope enables that. There's other people that you could talk to as well, but the point is, these are the things we have to be looking at, right? Because again, as we move to these solutions where we're outsourcing a lot of this stuff to environments we don't control, right? We're giving up control. That you want to get that control back in as much as we can, so that we can reduce that attack surface. Right?
Question back there?
Yeah.
How do you control if a user uses their work email address to register for a free Dropbox account or a Proxy account?
Yep. You can do that in here, so because we would be able to identify that in the transaction, what's happening. So you would see it that, hey, this is someone using this, trying to register to this service. Do you want to allow that to happen, right? So like in a discovery process for us, you would see a lot of that activity in general, and you would identify it to enable the conversation of how do we want to handle that. But no matter what you do, those are the right questions you've got to process through, regardless of what controls you adopt, right? Those are the questions you want to go through. Is like, how exposed are you to that anyway, right? We have been in some environments, like financial environments, where we've talked to them, where it's like, hey, we lock everything down. Nobody can do anything. Okay, great. You're less exposed. That's not necessarily the norm, right? Anything else? All right.
So we only have 5 minutes.
Yeah, let's skip over that, right? So best practices, right? Block the unnecessary services. You've got to be able to identify what's in your environment, regardless of the compensating control that's in place. You got to be able to control risky services. But the biggest thing is you've got to get a handle on unsanctioned instances of sanctioned applications, right? If you're moving to Office 365, because one of the big threats here is, one of the things I always thought about, if I'm taking an offensive security position and I'm coming into a customer that has Office 365, one of the things that I would do from a data exfiltration point is I would look to, if I can establish presence internally and start moving laterally and do some very cool things and get a hold of data, I would just upload it to a personal instance of OneDrive. Because they probably don't have anything like this in place, and what are they going to see at their firewall? They're just going to see OneDrive. And someone's probably going to go, yeah, we use OneDrive. We just moved to Office 365. Well, great. You didn't know it was me going to my instance of OneDrive with your data. Those are the types of things we want to care about and ask and look for to reduce that attack surface. And then after that, once we've kind of blocked that vector, we can't ignore the fact that Microsoft scans for viruses. So does Google. Right? So does Dropbox, so does Box, but nothing's 100%. I still want to get the assurance that I'm passing it through a malware inspection pipeline that I can control, right? That's independent of what I'm doing on the endpoint, right? Layered defense, right? Because if one control fails, the next one's gonna pick it up. So that legitimate traffic still passes through that system, and I can have a level of assurance that everything I can control, I am doing, right? That doesn't mean nothing bad is going to happen, but that certainly reduces the attack surface significantly and gives our constituents, our partners, whoever, that we're doing everything that we can. So, questions? All right, that's what we had, guys. Thank you.